Well, Human Rights Watch has released its 2020 World Report in Johannesburg. This is its annual review of human rights practices around the globe, assessing progress on major human rights issues during the past year in more than 90 countries and territories around the world, including 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The Johannesburg launch focuses on human rights developments in Southern Africa in 2019. And to help us unpack this, we're now joined in studio by Southern Africa Director from Human Rights Watch, Dewa Mavhinga. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having me. Thank you.
All right, so what is the state generally? Let's start with the big picture of human rights in Southern Africa.
Well, a huge disappointment, really, because if you're looking at how Southern African countries promised to respect human rights, have got human rights provisions in their constitutions. The performance over 2019 was dismal, was appalling, and I could single out, for example, Zimbabwe, where there is a massive humanitarian crisis that is silent. The population of Zimbabwe, about 8 million people, need food aid this year. And 2.2 million of those are in urban areas. There is a massive water crisis. There is no access to water for an urban population in Harare of about 4.5 million people. So it's a huge disaster that's unfolding, and the leadership is not stepping up to the plate.
All right, we'll get into the specifics of each country just now. Perhaps just in broad terms, how do you measure and what do you measure when we talk about human rights watching in the region?
Well, what we look at basically is the starting point is that all the countries have bills of human rights in their constitutions. So that's the starting point. And we look at different aspects for each country because it's difficult then to compare different rights in different countries. So, for example, in South Africa, we look at what were the key aspects. Is it issues around women's rights, gender-based violence, the MINEX movement? You look at access to education, you look at the inequalities that are there, you look at extreme poverty. You go to a different country, Mozambique, for example, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where you look at conflict and the impact of conflict on the enjoyment of rights. And then broadly, you look at other aspects. There is a huge problem with rampant endemic corruption across Southern Africa, which has an impact, negative impact on the enjoyment of rights.
All right, let's start to look at some of these countries now. Start by naming the countries that are most concerned to you, and then we'll go into them.
Well, one of the most concerning countries in Southern Africa, and most disappointing really, has been Zimbabwe, because the current leadership came in on the back of promises to promote human rights, to bring in a new democracy. And there was a sense that after Mugabe, there will be a new dispensation of human rights. But sadly, it has not been the case.
Have things gotten worse?
Absolutely, and by far, and in a short period of time, just over a year, people's rights to health, for example. Doctors went on strike for months on end, no attention to that from the authorities. We saw that women had nowhere safe to deliver their babies. They went to backyard gardens in the high-density suburbs of Mbari, and we saw the leadership, the First Lady, celebrating that kind of nonsense. It's quite appalling. It's bamboozling to understand what kind of leadership would look aside when the nation is in that kind of deep crisis.
What do the authorities attribute all of this to, and how do they excuse some of the things that they do, particularly when it's heavy-handedness by the police and things like that?
I think it's the arrogance and being drunk on power, on political power and authority, and the idea that they are in charge. So, for example, if you look at President Mnangagwa, he has been joking about poverty, about how people can no longer afford beef or can no longer afford decent meals. He says, well, it's now time for you to be healthy, to eat vegetables and things like that. So there is no serious attention or prioritization of the challenges that people are facing across Southern Africa.
Which other countries concern you?
Well, Mozambique, a huge concern in Mozambique. If you look at the north of Mozambique, Cabo Delgado province, suspected Islamist armed groups wreaking havoc there in terms of attacks on civilians, and also the responses from the authorities there, who have also closed out the space to media. So there is no access. People do not really know what is happening there. That's a huge concern. We know that President Nyusi, who was inaugurated today for his second term in office, has had a peace accord with Renamo. But within that, there has been a blanket amnesty that does not address human rights issues. But also, interestingly and worryingly, if you look at South Africa, there has been domestically some of the concerns around the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. And over the last year, serious attacks on foreign nationals, on truck drivers, in the context of xenophobia, but without adequate action from the authorities, from the police, to thoroughly investigate and hold accountable those people responsible and behind those attacks.
All right, so South Africa a concern. Eswatini, sadly, is always a country that comes up in some of these barometers. And how's that fared in this past year?
Well, in terms of civil and political rights in Eswatini, it is basically the same. There is no opening up. Opposition political parties are banned as they have been since 1973. But perhaps a bright spark has been that the courts there have progressively supported women's rights. So last year in August, there was a progressive decision that women should have equal rights in the context of marriage in terms of the marital laws. So that is a positive that we need to acknowledge. Angola as well had a decriminalization of same-sex relationship, and that is also an important point in terms of the enjoyment of rights in that context.
All right. What about Zambia?
Well, Zambia is a disappointment as well, because we thought that perhaps President Edgar Lungu would be, a doyen of democracy and human rights respect. But we have got human rights defenders, critics of Lungu, who are facing a number of trumped-up charges. The musician I.M. Pilato and others who have been dragged before the courts, who have been harassed and intimidated simply because they have challenged the authority. And this trend is also we have seen that in Malawi. It's a huge concern for us, because overall, SADC does not have that institution. The SADC tribunal has been stripped of its human rights authority. Right. So there is no way to go within SADC for people. But perhaps the light at the end of a very long tunnel is that South Africa is coming in as the chair of the AU in 2020. And we hope that that's an important position of authority and responsibility to advance and promote human rights.
Okay, I was going to ask you what needs to be done, but you've sort of half answered that now. But it seems like an enormous task where these countries sign up for these accords and these protocols and these processes, even enact them in their local laws, but then flout them. How can there be consequences that flow from this? What needs to happen?
I think the first point is to make the leadership across Southern Africa understand that human rights are not the enemy. They are mutually beneficial, and that it helps the economy of a country to respect human rights. Because there is a sense that human rights are inconveniences or are the back door through which opposition comes into power. Human rights must be there for everyone, must be protected and supported. And I think this is also a message for South Africa, because if there is no, for example, stability in Eswatini, in Lesotho, in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, in Zambia, it means there will be an influx onto the doorstep of South Africa, and that then puts pressure on resources and things like that. So it's important to have solutions out there so that at least there is stability and development broadly, and the entire region can go up together.
All right. There must be some encouraging signs from some countries. Botswana usually does quite well.
Yes, Botswana usually does quite well, but also there are concerns there. Also the treatment of refugees. There is a huge refugee camp, Dukwi camp, where refugees are being, we understand, forcibly returned to Namibia over the last year, to Zimbabwe and other places. So we are also urging Botswana to re-examine its human rights commitments, and all the countries in Southern Africa to re-look at the SADC tribunal and restore its authority, which it had before 2014.
All right, Mr. Mavhinga, we're going to have to leave it there for the time being. But I would imagine people can go onto your website and download this report and see it for themselves.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much indeed for your time.